Welcome to the Minnesota Department of Health's Contaminants of Emerging Concern Initiatives presentation on nomination, screening, and ranking process. Unfortunately, the Health Risk Assessment Unit was unable to host the June 3rd face-to-face meeting, which had to be canceled. However, we are glad that you have been able to join us for this online virtual presentation. This presentation is the first of a two-part series and provides an overview of the process that is used for nominating, screening, and ranking nominated contaminants. The second presentation will cover the results of this year's screening and ranking as well as a preliminary work plan for the next fiscal year. The Contaminants of Emerging Concern Initiative is funded through the Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment. Throughout the presentation, the abbreviation MDH will be used for the Minnesota Department of Health, and CEC will be used for Contaminants of Emerging Concern. The focus of this presentation is to provide background on the nomination, screening, and ranking process that is currently used by the CEC initiative to identify chemical candidates for full review and guidance development. We hope the presentation will be informative. If you have questions or would like to discuss issues related to this process in more detail, please send an email to health.risk@state.mn.us. Before we begin, we would like to review the definition MDH uses to define a contaminant of emerging concern. MDH identifies substances that have been released to, found in, or have the potential to enter Minnesota waters and pose a real or perceived health threat, do not already have Minnesota health-based guidance, or have new or changing health or exposure information that increases the level of concern. Substances that meet this definition are considered to be contaminants of emerging concern. On this slide, which shows puzzle pieces, I'll begin the background section on the nomination, screening, and ranking process that is currently used by the CEC initiative. When the CEC initiative was first formed in late 2009, MDH established a task group to provide input on developing a process for nominating, screening, and prioritization of chemicals. Representatives of a wide variety of stakeholders and experts from academia were invited to participate. Ultimately, the task group had members from several nonprofits, a couple of environmental consultants. Industry was represented by a toxicologist and environmental lawyer that was identified by the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, federal agencies such as the United States Geological Survey, several state agencies, and experts from St. Cloud State, the University of St. Thomas, and the University of Minnesota. The task group met 6 times over the course of 10 months. Task group members identified key issues of importance and made recommendations to MDH to develop an inclusive and transparent process. Based on MDH's suggestion and endorsed by the task group, a process that is used by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, Office of Water, for prioritizing potential drinking water contaminants for regulatory review was identified as a starting point. In particular, an EPA document that outlined a risk-based process for ranking the preliminary contaminant candidate list for inclusion in the final contaminant candidate list, or CCL. Appendix A of this particular EPA document specifically contained potency and severity scoring metrics for ranking drinking water contaminants. A reference to this document is provided at the end of the presentation. Based on recommendations and input from the task group, the EPA CCL process was supplemented to address several specific areas of concern that were identified by task group members. These areas of concern included evidence of endocrine activity, non-traditional contaminants such as pharmaceuticals, and the use of Minnesota-specific water monitoring data. MDH's current screening, scoring, and ranking process uses components of both the U.S. EPA's Office of Water CCL methodology and incorporates the task group recommendations. The resulting process is shown in this graphic and is comprised of 4 steps. The first step is nomination. Step 2 is evaluation of eligibility. Step 3 is toxicity and exposure screening. And step 4 is ranking and selection for full review. Each step will be briefly discussed in more detail in the next set of slides. Step 1 is nominations. MDH's CEC homepage contains a link to an online public nomination form, the location which is pointed out by the red arrow on the slide. This form can be used to nominate at any time. The CEC homepage also contains links to the nominated contaminant status table, which is shown in the image behind the homepage on the slide. This table is updated on a quarterly basis and contains two tables. Table 1 provides a summary of a nominated contaminants grouped by status. In other words, which step in the process is the contaminant currently at? Table 2 provides a list of all nominated chemicals to date in alphabetical order. This list includes a summary of when and who nominated the chemical, as well as the supporting rationale that was provided by the nominator. All nominated contaminants are included in the list. If a contaminant has been determined not to be eligible for CEC initiative review, it is still listed. If a contaminant has been nominated more than once, that information is also included. The best way to keep abreast of Minnesota's CEC initiative activities is to subscribe to our free GovDelivery service. Signing up is easy and can be done by simply clicking on Get Email Updates, which is located in the upper right-hand corner of the web page, circled in red on the slide. Step 2 is an evaluation of eligibility for the CEC initiative. At this step, several questions are asked to determine whether the nominated contaminant is eligible to be addressed through the CEC initiative. The first question is, does the nomination contain sufficient information to identify a contaminant? For example, a nomination of chemicals in stormwater would not contain sufficiently clear contaminant identification information, and therefore would not be considered eligible for further evaluation. To be considered eligible, the answer to this question needs to be yes. The second question is, does the contaminant meet the definition of a CEC? Minnesota's working definition of a CEC is a substance that has been released to, found in, or has the potential to enter Minnesota waters and poses a real or perceived health threat, or does not already have Minnesota human health-based guidance, or has new and changing health or exposure information that increases the level of concern. To be eligible, the answer to this question also needs to be yes. The third and final question is, has or is the contaminant being sufficiently addressed by other programs? Funded initiatives such as the CEC initiative can supplement existing programs at MDH, but they cannot supplant the work of other programs. For example, if a nominated chemical is on the Health Risk Limit Program's work plan, it would not be considered eligible for review under the CEC initiative. To be considered eligible, the answer to this question needs to be no. Step 3 is toxicity and exposure screening. The task group endorsed the use of EPA's Office of Water CCL prioritization process as a starting point. EPA's process has been used for many years and was developed based on recommendations from the National Academy of Science and the National Drinking Water Advisory Council. The screening and prioritization process uses simple criteria to identify a contaminant's potential for health risk or toxicity and the potential to occur in drinking water or exposure. For more details regarding toxicity and exposure are provided in the next several slides. Toxicity screening evaluation looks at what dose levels cause health effects, as well as the type and severity of those health effects. As a starting point, MDH adopted the scoring approach from EPA's CCL process, which included the scoring metrics from Appendix A of the CCL document. Contaminants that are more potent, causing effects at lower doses, or that cause more severe or long-lasting effects, are scored higher. The task group recommended expanding EPA's scoring approach to highlight specific concerns that they believe to be more relevant to CECs. As a result, MDH's screening evaluation also specifically assesses the available information regarding potential endocrine activity, developmental or reproductive toxicity, and genotoxicity, as well as evidence of bioaccumulation and whether the contaminants typically co-occur with other similarly structured compounds. Please note that this is a screening evaluation, which is meant to be a relatively quick assessment. The focus is on accessing and evaluating readily available information for the purpose of prioritizing the contaminant. An extensive in-depth search and review is not conducted at this point in the process. Exposure screening evaluation also uses the EPA Office of Water CCL process as a starting point. Over time, MDH has modified this process to be more focused on how the contaminant can be released to water, how easily it moves through the environment, how long it persists in the environment, how likely it is to occur in Minnesota sources of drinking water, and the detection frequency and measured concentrations from monitoring studies. The task group recommended expanding EPA's scoring approach for exposure to include trends in chemical use. For example, is the use expanding? The presence on lists such as the USGS's Tier 1 and Tier 2, or California's list of biomonitored chemicals. Another expansion includes determining whether there is high potential for exposure from non-water sources, such as consumer products, so that the total exposure potential is also considered. Step 4 is a risk-based ranking of the screened and scored contaminants. This ranking is based on the toxicity and exposure scores, represented here on the graph as percent of maximum possible scores. Exposure is on the x-axis and toxicity is on the y-axis. The goal of ranking is to identify contaminants of higher concern from those of lower concern. Some contaminants may have very limited or no information such that they cannot be scored or ranked. Please remember that the ranking conducted here is relative only to the other screened nominated contaminants, and it is not the universe of existing chemicals. In addition to risk-based ranking, the feasibility of developing guidance is also considered. During the screening process, the quality and quantity of publicly available toxicity data is noted and is used to determine whether sufficient information is likely to be available for deriving contaminant-specific guidance values. Higher-ranked contaminants with adequate information are identified as the best candidates for guidance development. Contaminants that are not selected for full review remain eligible for future selection. Stakeholder input is the final step in developing the review work plan. The preliminary work plan is shared with stakeholders, and stakeholders are encouraged to provide input on the need and the usefulness of guidance development for the identified contaminants, as well as to ask questions and to make suggestions for improvements to the process. This concludes the background presentation on MDH's nomination, screening, and ranking process. A key resource that was mentioned during the presentation is MDH's CEC homepage, which is located at www.health.state.mn.us/CEC. URLs for individual additional CEC pages and for the EPA Office of Water CCL document that served as a starting point for the screening and ranking process are also provided in this slide. We hope this presentation was informative. If you have questions or would like to discuss issues related to the nomination, screening, and ranking process in more detail, please send an email to health.risk@state.mn.us. Thank you.